As the United States' unprecedented strike on Venezuela sent shockwaves around the world, developing nations are calling for greater unity across the global south. From BRICS expansion to deeper South-South cooperation, China says shared development, mutual respect and collective voices are essential to reform global governance, long dominated by Western interests. This underscores long-standing calls from the Global South for a collective voice against unilateral power. How can developing nations secure their future and protect their independence against unilateralism? Later, we'll be joined by a panel representing parts of the Global South, but we begin with Paulo Nogueira Batista Jr. He's a Brazilian economist, a founding vice president of the BRICS New Development Bank, and the former executive director of the IMF. Paulo, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
There is deepening concern across much of the world about how the United States is using its financial power and the influence of the dollar for ideological and for political ends. We've seen how the United States uses sanctions against countries that don't toe its line. But there is a new system that's now developed, an alternative system to using the dollar for international payments. It's being done by a group of countries, the BRICS countries. What is the new system? How does it work? And is it a durable alternative to the dollar?
Look, to be precise, I would say, to try to be precise, it's a complex issue. I would say that the developing countries, the BRICS countries, are still struggling to build alternatives. There's one country that's moved further away and has moved further in this direction, which is China. China's doing a lot to create alternative payment systems, alternative methods of financing that are required. But the BRICS as a group are still at the beginning of a process to create alternatives to the US dollar. It's a long process, it's a difficult process, it's politically charged, because you pointed out, you mentioned the financial sanctions that were applied by the United States and Europe in the last years. But in 2025, and now in the beginning of 2026, we have new factors. We have the use of tariffs, import tariffs, the wholesale break of international agreements by the United States, and the use of military force or threat of use of military force in a way that exacerbates what the American empire was doing before. So the challenge is immense right now. And it's not only monetary and financial, obviously, but in some cases, it's I would say countries are running existential threats, given the way the United States is behaving as an imperial power.
Now, as you point out, the BRICS countries are still working on finding a durable alternative system of international payments. What would this system be based on? Would it be a basket of currencies, or would it be relying on technologies like blockchain?
I think both things you mentioned would be present in an alternative system. But what we would need ultimately is to devise a way of creating an alternative currency, a new currency that would serve for international transactions and reserve holding purposes. But this is my opinion, an opinion of some economists in the BRICS, but it's not an official line. It has not been defined as an official objective even. So I would say that there's when you look at the media, you have it's often, very often, an exaggerated impression of what the BRICS are achieving or are aiming at. Even in Donald Trump, even before he became president, he exaggerated wildly the extent to which the BRICS as a group represent a threat to the United States dollar. He even accused the group of having been created to destroy the dollar, which is completely absurd. So we need to take our time. I think, of course, there's something that might change completely the picture, which is, imagine you have a new financial collapse in the United States of the scale that you had in 2008, 2009. That would be a watershed. That would bring new challenges, would weaken the dollar, probably, weaken the United States, and people would be scrambling for alternatives. That's why I've been making the point repeatedly in BRICS discussions. in Brazil and China and Russia, I've been making the point that we need to get ready. We need to imagine alternative solutions in detail, you know. But so far, the intellectual and political progress in this area has been, for me, frustrating, because I believe I'm one of the ones that since 2023, when the United States and Europe intensified the sanctions, notably against Russia, I've been of the belief that this is a major problem for the world. And if you look at the global South, the only countries that can get together to lead something in that direction are some of the BRICS. It's at least some of the BRICS.
How do the relatively new financial institutions like the New Development Bank, also known as the BRICS Development Bank, as well as the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, how do they fit into the rollout of trying to find a new alternative payment system?
That's the first step the BRICS actually took, and China with the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. That was back in 2015. We were conscious of the fact that we could not rely anymore on the hope of a reform, a large-scale reform of the World Bank and the IMF, and that we needed to build alternative mechanisms. 10 years have gone. I took part in that, as you know. 10 years have gone by since the BRICS took these major initiatives. And the progress has been, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but you know, I've worked enormously with the BRICS during my last 10 years of activity as a policymaker and then as a researcher. But I'm quite conscious of the fact that even, for example, the New Development Bank that the BRICS created, of which I was a founding member, it has a long way to go to become a true world alternative to the World Bank. And the Chinese are well aware of that. I remember talking to my Chinese colleagues, and they always recommended patience, long-term thinking. These are not easy challenges. Anyway, I, as a Brazilian, more immediatist than the Chinese, I think we're moving slowly with respect to the New Development Bank, slowly with respect to alternatives to the dollar. But we're forced to take stances, you know, because the way the United States behaves doesn't leave us many alternatives. We need to think of our own way of doing things, given the failure of the system that the West controls.
As you say, progress is very slow. What do you see as the main challenges?
I think there are two things. One is technical, because all these issues, a World Bank rival to the IMF, an alternative payment system to SWIFT, an alternative currency to the US dollar, all these issues are technically very complex. But there's also, more importantly, I would say, a political problem. See, all of the global South countries, with few exceptions, all of the BRICS, even Russia, even China, amazing as it may seem, are vulnerable to US pressure, to Western pressure, and are vulnerable to influence groups from within the countries that oppose anything that might represent a challenge to the West. That's true of Brazil, notably, much more than China or Russia, of course. It's true of South Africa, it's true of India, you know, to speak only of the five members that created the New Development Bank. So we have what I often call a fifth column inside these countries, which work systematically to impede independent alternatives to the West. You know? So it's not an easy process. It's challenging, and the U.S. has become so threatening. I will tell you quite frankly, when Donald Trump started making major threats against the BRICS because of the dollar, because of the supposed threat to the dollar, this frightened many people in the BRICS. Many people became very cautious, decided to delay discussions, you know. I think it's a mistake, but the reality is that people in our countries are often, you know, vulnerable to American threats, except perhaps, I think we need to distinguish, really, when you look at the global South, you need to distinguish Russia and China from the rest. Russia and China are countries that are capable of facing up to the threats and actions of the United States. most countries in the global south are vulnerable, much more vulnerable. So it's not an easy life for those that want to see a different world.
The effort to find alternative systems, as you've pointed out, has been going on for some time. But I'm wondering, to what extent did that effort gain new urgency when we saw the manner in which the United States imposed financial sanctions against Russia in the aftermath of the Ukraine crisis?
This fact that you just mentioned was a watershed, because it became clear to everyone at the time, everyone responsible, that if the freezing of such a large amount of Russian reserves, around the equivalent of $300 billion, is possible, anything can happen. So countries like China, Iran, others began moving away from the dollar, moving their applications from U.S. treasuries to other assets that could be considered safe. No? And this has led, for example, to an explosion of gold prices since 2022. This is a reflection of the fact that the dollar is no longer seen as a safe haven. So you need to look for other safe havens. Can that be gold? Can that be silver? Can that be the Chinese renminbi? Can other currencies of Western countries do the job? All of this is occurring, these movements away from the US dollar into other alternatives. And if you look at the most recent data, you will see that for the first time, gold has a larger weight in international reserves as a whole than US dollar applications. This is completely unprecedented. The dollar is still the major currency, but gold has become a major rival to the United States as a reserve asset.
Paulo, we have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
There's much more to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Abdullahi Boru Halakhe is an Africa security and policy analyst. Zoon Ahmed is a research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, and Liang is a chair professor in economics at Willamette University. Thanks everyone for being with us. Liang, let me start with you. Now, the countries collectively known as the Global South are seeing some of the fastest growth rates, fastest GDP growth rates that we are seeing today. They also have young populations and expanding populations, but they're also beset by a number of challenges. They have a lack of infrastructure in many instances. They struggle to get finance. They have difficulty adopting new technologies. And of course, many of these countries are mired in poverty as well. But there is good news. China has opened partnerships with many of these countries in the Global South to address some of these challenges through things like the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. How do you see the way ahead?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think the Global South countries, as you mentioned, they're very resourceful. They're accounting for 60% of the world population, 42% of trade, 42% of GDP, 44% of trade, 58% of capital FDI flows. And they're also accounting for close to 70% of renewable energy potentials and transitional minerals. So as you can see, if these resources can pull together and countries can leverage on their collective strengths, that would really help to empower the development. But as you also rightly point out, that there are so many challenges, especially after the COVID pandemic. Countries are experiencing, public health crises, climate crises, that injustice, and now increasing, geopolitical tensions and geoeconomic fragmentations. So I think all of these pose tremendous challenges. But you're also pointing out, I think correctly, that China, among other, Global South leaders, are really taking the lead role and trying to provide the kinds of opportunities for countries to cooperate and to build a kind of unity and solidarity. So I think this kind of collective strength is really important to empower, developing countries to overcome some of these challenges, especially unilateralism and also many of these challenges that I just mentioned.
Zoon, let's talk about a country with which you will be familiar, and that's Pakistan. It's faced persistent economic challenges. When you look at these kinds of challenges that Pakistan faces, how does it align with or differ from the broader economic challenges that the Global South faces?
Well, I think, Anand, firstly, what we see in today's world, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, is that the Global South essentially has grown in its significance, in its ability to, collaborate, develop platforms. Also, with China's rise and China's initiatives, we have new ways to understand what really is the way ahead, what kind of development we really want. And most importantly, I think before I come to Pakistan, I'll also mention that recent incidents have made the importance of better enforcement of international law. And I think this is a collective quest of the Global South. But of course, the Global South is not a monolith. That said, I think Pakistan also faces certain economic challenges. Even from almost 2 decades ago, we had a severe economic crisis and also security challenges. And then in 2015, when China initially announced the CPEC, when Pakistan and China jointly announced the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor's first phase, it really was a solution to those economic challenges, which included infrastructure, energy. Increasingly, we have also focused on poverty alleviation, value creation. We have focused on, rural revitalization, smarter agriculture, industrialization, processing. All of these things. And most significantly, I think one of the things that you and Liang both mentioned was that really the Global South has a young populations, which is untapped potential in many cases. And in that sense, the cooperation with China and what Pakistan's focus has really been in the last, what we call the phase 2 of CPEC and overall Pakistan's development posture, is to train our young people. Mm-hmm. And that's where, again, China is playing a crucial role.
Abdullahi, how has the legacy of colonialism and imperialism shaped the politics and economics of the Global South? Are we in a post-colonial era, or has the nature of colonialism changed, where countries are still very dependent on their former colonial masters?
I think the legacies of colonialism is pretty much alive. I think it's just that it is changing the shape and format that it takes. But I think one of the other things that really, for many African countries, that there's not one path to development. There are multiple ways. And I think the fracture of post-1945 global order that everybody is gnashing their teeth about, for many African countries, there wouldn't be a better time to be able to double dip, multi-dip, because you have China on one hand that has demonstrated in action and deeds on how to lift a significant number of people out of poverty. You have Gulf Arab countries, we can get into some of their negative actions, but also they've got enough resources, and they are looking for places where they can get a return on their investment. So it behooves African countries to really develop plans, and that starts with education system. Educate enough number of people, particularly the young ones. If you don't, they are going to not sit idle by and just wait for you to leave power. I think there is an opportunity, while acknowledging that there are tremendous amount of challenges, and it's not enough to just sit by and admire the problems. Acknowledge the problems and pursue a path that can lift people out of poverty and into prosperity.
Yang, how does China's increasing economic and political footprint in the Global South challenge what has been traditional Western-led models of development? If we look at one metric, for instance, we look at poverty alleviation in China. China's been able to achieve that in a relatively short space of time. Can something like this be emulated in other parts of the developing world?
Well, I think that there are a lot of the debates about whether or not China's growth path or its development strategies is unique or it can be replicable. But I think what China has been doing or proving is that countries could rise, countries could develop through peaceful means and through, basically their hard work, right? Harnessing government resources, government support, and mobilizing their resources domestically and build that sort of international connections. So I think a lot of the so-called China, successful I would say model, right, or these recipes, I think can be learned by the rest of the world. And definitely China is playing a very important role now globally. As you mentioned, China has been providing financing, right? BRI and actually broadly development finance has, from China really helped to many developing countries to build their infrastructure and to really industrialize. And so $1.3 trillion is what China has been providing to the rest of the world since the early 2000s. So I think this tremendous financial resources, as well as China's know-how, right, how to build infrastructure, also trade workers. For example, Huawei has been training tens of thousands, if not more, workers in Africa and many other countries in the world.
Zoon, you were talking about technology a moment ago and the role of technology in the developing world. We know that technology is moving at such an incredibly fast rate. I mean, when you look at AI, for instance, digital transformation in general, I mean, would it empower developing countries, or do those countries also run the risk where you could see deepening inequality?
I think, like any technology, like any advancement, really, the key players who are creating the avenues may be the ones that have more capacity to ensure that they remain the leaders. And I think where China is really breaking that cycle and breaking that negative precedent to some extent is by understanding that really through global partnerships, and also understanding that if we realize certain risks of these technologies together, and we have better mechanisms, international mechanisms that are protecting, users, or when the technology advances in a certain way, we are able to have laws that all countries can protect, all countries can enforce. I think that can really create the space to reduce the chances of AI and these emerging technologies to act as, to increase the gap between the haves and the have-nots. But of course, I mean, it's too soon to predict. What I do think is that a lot of countries that would not have access to developing their own platforms and to utilize this technology, whether it's, in infrastructure development or in other, industries, they have increasing access. And I think by allowing and by creating the space of giving this access to developing countries, China is also incentivizing maybe other key players, other leaders. China has, by announcing the BRI, by making sure that we share, China sharing the technologies that they have increased the expectation also of developing countries from other key players in the world. So I think if we had this AI race happening 20 years ago, when China was not the key player, the chances of it acting as, creating the gap, increasing the gap between developed and developing countries would have been more. And today that chance is less. But that said, I do think, Anand, that one of the biggest challenges that the Global South faces, whether it's, the collective decision to ensure that emerging technologies benefit more than they harm, whether it is the collective decision to call out wrong when it's done, to call out countries when they break international law, this is something that will take more work. Today, we are not in a world where we are the silent majority. Yeah. The Global South definitely has a voice, but we need to, within our regions, look beyond, regional issues and to think of, what is better for the world at large. And I feel that's where we, the Global South, are lacking right now. Right. And I think China can play an important role in that.
Abdullahi, we also see conflict in many parts of the Global South, and this conflict is being framed as a security threat to the industrialized countries, especially when it comes to things like access to resources. I mean, how can we rethink conflict resolution, peace building, in enabling the Global South to have a greater voice? And I mean, who should be leading those efforts?
I think we can draw from history. I think if you look at some of the major conflicts on the continent, for instance, Sudan, South Sudan was one of the longest running civil war until the secession of South Sudan in 2011. That process was predominantly led by the African countries via African Union, and they came to a resolution that eventually led to South Sudan seceding. I think for majority of African countries and institutions, it is about stop facing either East or West. It is about looking at what works for them. And secondly, one of the byproducts of many of the conflicts, as deadly as they are, and they have played a significant role in rolling back some of the gains that have been made the previous decades. For instance, in the DRC, I think many African countries still, despite conflict and particularly the refugee situation being framed as a threat to the West, majority of the refugees stay in the regional countries. And what is even more remarkable is that in many of those countries, I can give Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, and including Chad, where I was there just before Christmas, many of those refugees are given the opportunity, right to work, freedom of movement, and right to own property. While simultaneously in the West, on top of taking aid out of the system, that is foreign humanitarian aid, they are also hardening their borders. So I think for many African countries, they need to develop their own confidence and saying that, look, we can do some of these things. There are no magic recipes. It is sheer hard work and working with others who have done, particularly China, especially on the hardware. Here I'm talking about roads, bridges, large-scale infrastructure, power generation, where, like, if you take, for instance, the DRC, one of the largest dams in the region, can actually supply electricity to many of the countries in the region. But because of conflict, that has not taken place. There are opportunities, but I think hard decisions need to be made. I just want to make one little point that the previous speaker mentioned about the role of technology. Just a simple technology in Kenya of mobile money transfer has brought so many people into to be bankable. People who, mainstream banks have ignored. Now they transact businesses, not just in Kenya, across the region, and that is what technology can do. But I'm not blind to the fact that technology can also exacerbate differences and inequality in many societies.
Liang, we have seen how the United States uses its economic and trade domination to impose tariffs on other countries. Many of those countries, of course, are in the global south. It's caused enormous problems for those countries for their economic growth plans. How do they meet that challenge?
Well, I think first of all, I think we need to recognize that the United States as a trading nation is increasingly less relevant, right, or is becoming more and more sidelined because of its own policy. So I think that really paved the way, right, to actually alternative system where countries could actually, especially in the global south, could trade more with each other. They could expand the trade routes, lower the trade frictions, and also increasing market access. We have been seeing this, right, based on ASEAN countries or African continent, as well as in Latin American countries and across these continents. I think increasingly we're seeing South-South trade that is actually surpassing both North-South trade and North-North trade. So I think there's a lot of potential for global South countries to cooperate, right, giving the complementarity of their economies and giving also the collective large market size. So I think the way is really not to wait for the United States to change its mind, right, but really to expand the kinds of trade connections amongst themselves, but also try to push, I think, collective voice, right, at forums like WTO and the regional trade agreements to really, I think, in some ways to pressure the United States. Either they will have to change the course of actions and join the global trading system, or they will be left behind, which I think is actually, not conducive to their own economic growth. And so I think that is really important for all the developing countries to collectively counter against this kinds of economic coercion.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.